The members of the California State Board of Equalization thank you for attending today's webinar presentation. As a member of the nation's only elected tax board, each member represents the taxpayers in one of 4 equalization districts. The 5th member of the board is the state controller. Senator George Renner represents the 1st BOE district, which spans much of inland California, from Los Angeles County to the Oregon border. The 1st District has field offices in Bakersfield, Fresno, Redding, Sacramento, and Santa Clarita. Member Fiona Ma is the representative in the 2nd District, which encompasses much of the California coast from Santa Barbara up to the Oregon border. The 2nd District has field offices located in Fairfield, Oakland, Salinas, San Francisco, San Jose, and Santa Rosa. Member Jerome Horton represents the BOE's 3rd District, which includes Los Angeles and Ventura counties. District 3 has field offices in Ventura, Glendale, Culver City, West Covina, and Norwalk. Member Diane Harkey is the representative for the 4th District, which covers the southernmost part of California, both the coast and the inland areas. District 4 has field offices in Irvine, Riverside, Rancho Mirage, San Diego, and El Centro. As the state's chief financial officer, State Controller Betty Yee serves the board as its 5th member. Not sure which member represents you? It's easy to find out. Visit our website at boe.ca.gov and click on Find Your Board Member. Thanks again for watching, and thank you for doing business in California.
Hello and welcome to our webinar. Today we're discussing the Manufacturing and Research and Development Equipment Partial Exemption. My name is Robert Prasad with the California State Board of Equalization.
And I'm Brad Miller, a Business Taxes Specialist here at the BOE. Thank you for taking the time to join us.
During this webinar, we encourage you to email your questions to the address on the screen. If we don't get to your question during the webinar, or if you're reviewing this from our archive, we will still provide a response to your question in a timely manner. The BOE administers the sales and use tax as well as other special taxes and fees. Today, we're going to discuss one of the new exemptions to the sales and use tax law, the Manufacturing and Research and Development Equipment Partial Exemption. Today, we will discuss how it applies to construction contractors. Brad, tell me a little bit about this partial exemption.
Well, Robert, this is a partial exemption, so you're only going to pay part of the tax rate on your purchases of qualifying equipment. There are certain requirements that need to be met, and we'll be going over those in specific detail today.
Today we'll discuss topics of the partial exemption rate and operative dates, the partial exemption qualifications, special purpose buildings, contractors and subcontractors, exemption certificates, and the annual limit. What is a partial exemption, Brad?
Well, a partial exemption, Robert, is an exemption where you're only going to pay part of the tax rate. In this case, they're going to be paying a tax rate of 3.3125% plus any district tax.
And when does this exemption apply?
This exemption applies to any purchases made on or after July 1st, 2014 through June 30th, 2022.
So if a business was going to purchase a piece of equipment for $100,000, that would result in a tax savings of over $4,000?
Correct. And if they were to purchase materials and fixtures totaling $500,000 to construct a special purpose building, they would save over $20,000 in tax.
So in computing the tax rate, for example, the city of Sacramento, where we have a 1% district tax, you would take the 3.3125% partial tax rate plus the 1% district tax for a total tax rate of 4.3125%.
Correct. For a total tax savings of 4.1875%.
Let's go to a question. Can we obtain a credit or refund of sales tax paid at the full rate for our purchases of qualified property during the period in which the partial exemption is in place?
Yes, you can. If you paid tax at the full rate and you're buying qualified property for a qualified person, you can obtain a refund for that tax. Typically, you're going to go back to your vendor, but you may be able to file your claim directly with the board. We'll talk about that in more detail later.
To qualify for the partial exemption, 3 requirements must be met. Number 1, they must be a qualified person. 2, they must purchase qualified property. And 3, they must use that property in a qualifying manner. So Brad, what is a qualified person?
Well, a qualified person is anybody that's engaged in the business of manufacturing or research and development. We use the North American Industrial Classification System codes, or NAICS codes, to determine whether someone's qualified. So if they're in manufacturing, they need to be in NAICS codes 3111 to 3399, or for research and development, they need to be in codes 541711 or 541712.
We have a question regarding this issue. If I do manufacturing, but my primary NAICS code is not in the qualified range, can I still qualify for the exemption?
Yes, you can. If your primary NAICS code isn't qualified, but you have a segment of your business known as an establishment that is engaged in a qualifying activity, you may qualify for the partial exemption for that establishment. You'll need to maintain separate books and records for that establishment, and then any equipment purchases for that establishment may qualify.
Here's another question. How do I know that the company I've been hired by is a qualified person?
Typically, if you're being hired by a qualified person, you're going to know because that person's going to tell you. They're usually going to be providing you an exemption certificate, and it's going to state to you that they are a qualified person.
Brad, what property qualifies for the exemption?
We're typically going to be dealing with machinery and equipment and component parts, equipment and devices used to operate, control, regulate, or maintain the machinery, such as computers and software, property used in pollution control, and relevant to our discussion today, special purpose buildings.
Is there anything else that may impact whether the property qualifies?
Yes, the property needs to have a useful life for state income tax purposes of 1 or more years. Typically, this means you're going to be capitalizing and depreciating the property, not expensing it.
Let's go to another question. Does the partial exemption apply to equipment that contractors purchase or rent for use on a qualified job, such as a crane or a jackhammer?
Typically, no. The equipment exemption applies to equipment for the qualified person, not for use by the contractor doing a job for the qualified person. So the crane or jackhammer wouldn't be subject to the partial exemption.
A third condition that must be met is that the purchaser must use the equipment more than 50% of the time in a qualifying manner. What exactly does that mean?
What that means is the property needs to be used in any stage of manufacturing, processing, fabricating, refining, or the recycling process, or used in research and development. It can be used to maintain, repair, measure, or test any qualified property, and it also includes materials or fixtures furnished and installed by a construction contractor in constructing a special purpose building.
Let's talk about special purpose buildings. What exactly is a special purpose building?
A special purpose building is a building used specifically for manufacturing or research and development. For example, if you have a clean room that you need to do your research and development and you need to have that constructed, that's going to be a special purpose building.
Does the entire building need to be used in a qualifying manner?
Not necessarily. As long as no more than 1/3 of the usable volume is used in a non-qualifying manner, the entire building still qualifies.
So you mentioned usable volume and not square footage as being used to calculate the qualifying portion of the building. What happens if the non-qualifying portion of the building exceeds 1/3 of the usable volume?
If it exceeds 1/3 of the usable volume, then only the qualifying portion of the building will qualify for the partial exemption, and the non-qualifying portion would not.
Let's read another question. How do I determine if the whole building qualifies for the exemption? What is exempt in the building?
Well, again, we're using usable volume, so you're going to use length times width times height to determine the usable volume for the qualifying portion of the building. If the whole building qualifies, then we're going to be looking at all the materials and fixtures that go into the construction of that building being subject to the partial tax exemption.
So how exactly does a construction contractor take advantage of this partial exemption?
What's going to happen is the qualified person is going to hire a contractor to build their special purpose building. So then they're going to issue them an exemption certificate so that the contractor can then buy those materials and fixtures subject to that partial exemption.
And does this apply only to the contractor hired by the qualified person, or does it apply to subcontractors as well?
It applies to subcontractors as well.
Okay, let's read some more questions. Can contractors get a refund of tax on items they purchased prior to knowing about this exemption? If so, can they get the refund directly from the board, or do they have to ask their vendor for the refund?
Contractors can get a refund of tax if they paid the full tax rate and they're doing a job for a qualified person. They can either file a claim with their vendor or if they paid the tax directly to the board, then they can file a claim with the BOE directly.
Okay, here's another question. My customer, qualified person, is requesting that I bill them time and material and charge them tax so they can take advantage of the manufacturing exemption. I only bill lump sum. Do I still have to issue a time and material in order for my customer to take advantage of the partial exemption?
Not necessarily. They can contract with their customer however they wish. Lump sum, time and material, it doesn't matter. They can still take advantage of the partial exemption. But as we'll talk about in a little bit, they will need to give some information to their customer about the material costs in that job.
To document sales subject to the partial exemption, a seller should obtain an exemption certificate from the purchaser.
Correct. Documentation is very important. We have created 2 specific exemption certificates that taxpayers can use to document this exemption. The BOE 230M, which is a partial exemption certificate for manufacturing, research, and development equipment, and the BOE 230MC, which is for construction contracts for the partial exemption.
A copy of each certificate is shown here. Brad, are taxpayers required to use these certificates?
Not necessarily. We make these available for their convenient use, but they're welcome to use any document they wish as long as it contains all of the required elements. It needs to include their name, address and phone number, and permit number of the purchaser, a statement that the purchaser is a qualified person or a construction contractor for a qualified person. It needs to include a description of the property purchased and a statement that that property is qualified property, statement that the property purchased will be used in a qualifying activity or a construction contract. It needs to include a date, and finally it needs to be signed.
Let's go to another taxpayer question. My company has been hired to do a remodel of a client's building where they will use an area of the building for research and development. Some of the materials will be purchased new, but some will be reused from an existing part of the building. How will the taxes be paid on each of these?
The contractor can purchase the materials subject to the partial exemption. They'll just need to issue an exemption certificate to their vendor when they buy those materials. As far as the materials that are going to be reused, tax has already been paid on those, so they don't need to pay any tax again. So that's already taken care of.
How does documentation work for a construction contract?
Well, what's going to happen is the qualified person, the manufacturing company, is going to issue an exemption certificate, a BOE 230M, to the contractor. Then the contractor is going to provide a copy of that BOE 230M to any subcontractors that they hire to do the actual work. At the same time, they're going to issue a BOE 230MC to the subcontractor. Now the subcontractor can go out and buy materials and fixtures for this job by issuing a BOE 230MC to their vendor.
This partial exemption has an annual cap of $200 million of qualifying purchases in a year. This cap applies to each qualified person. How does this affect construction contracts?
Well, what's going to happen is since the $200 million cap applies to each qualified person, the contractor is going to need to provide the information to the qualified person about the cost of the materials and fixtures that went into that job, since it counts towards that qualified person's cap.
It's important to note that this cap applies to the qualified person and not the construction contractor. Therefore, a construction contractor may be involved in construction contracts for numerous qualified persons at the same time and may purchase up to $200 million in materials and fixtures for each qualified person in a calendar year. Let's take another question. If I contract on a lump sum basis, do I still have to tell my customer the cost of the materials that I used?
Yes, you do. Even if you're contracting on a lump sum basis, because that cost price of those items apply to the cap for that person, you're going to need to share that information with the qualified person so they can keep track of that for the cap.
Here's another question. As a contractor, do I have to register for a seller's permit with the BOE to issue an exemption certificate?
Not necessarily. There's no requirement that you have a seller's permit with the BOE to issue an exemption certificate. However, if you are furnishing and installing fixtures or you're acting as a retailer of materials, you would need to have a seller's permit.
How do I use the exemption when I self-report the tax?
If you're going to be self-reporting the tax, you're going to report that as a purchase subject to use tax on your return, and then you'll also report it on the exemption line for the manufacturer's exemption, so you end up reporting it at the partial rate instead of the full rate.
Do the materials and fixtures I sell to my customer have to meet the useful life requirement?
Well, as we talked about before, there is a requirement that the property have a useful life of 1 or more years for state income tax purposes. However, since typically when you're talking about a building, that's going to be capitalized and depreciated, so any of the items that go into the building are going to qualify.
We understand this can be a very difficult topic since it involves some complex issues, but it can result in significant tax savings.
That is why we are here to help. We have a number of resources available to help you better understand how you may properly take advantage of this partial tax exemption. The email link to send us a question can be used at any time, even if you're watching this webinar from our archive.
We have detailed information about this exemption available on our website. We have created a number of industry-specific web pages for taxpayers in various types of industries. We have a web page specifically for manufacturing and research and development.
Finally, you are welcome to contact our Customer Service Center Monday through Friday between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. by calling our toll-free number at 1-800-400-7115.
And thank you again for watching this webinar. If we did not cover one of your questions, please watch for your response in your email. We'll be getting back to you in a timely manner. To receive announcements about future webinar topics, dates, and times, please visit our webpage at boe.ca.gov/webinars. We'll see you next time.